So have you ever wondered if the way we study society in India is just an imported Western science? Or is it something completely distinct, forged by its own incredibly unique and honestly pretty turbulent history? It's a huge question, and the answer completely flips how we look at the social sciences today.
Well, let's dive into this explainer and uncover the truly fascinating dialectical story of how sociology actually evolved in India. It's a wild ride through ancient observations, colonial agendas, and a really fierce intellectual rebellion.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. A uniquely Indian science. 2. Ancient roots and observers. 3. The British colonial lens. 4. The Indian intellectual response. And finally, 5. Early academic beginnings.
All right, part 1. A uniquely Indian science, the imprint of culture. Think about physics for a second. When a physicist uses the Saha equation, it applies universally, right? Doesn't matter where you are. But human sciences, that's a whole different ballgame. They bear the unmistakable imprint of a nation's unique historical trauma, its cultural configuration, and in India's case, a massive colonial past. You simply cannot separate the science of society from the history of that society. Moving right along to part 2, Ancient Roots and Observers, Debunking the Myth. Get a load of this. Western thinkers, like the sociologist Robert Bierstead, audaciously dismissed the existence of Eastern social thought entirely. He essentially claimed sociology never appealed to the Eastern mind. But as we're going to see, the historical evidence tells a vastly different, deeply empirical story.
Because the reality on the ground was far from just abstract spiritual philosophy. Ancient Indian texts were actually highly practical treatises. Take Kautilya's Arthasastra from over 2 millennia ago. It literally mandated regular census of subjects and livestock. Even Manu's Dharmashastra detailed complex social rules tied to specific places and times. This was real, grounded social observation.
And way before the British ever showed up, you had diverse foreign travelers and empiricists carefully documenting India's complex kin-based societies. You've got the Greek ambassador Megasthenes noting class divisions all the way back in 300 BC. Then the Arab traveler Al-Biruni in the 10th century actually studying Sanskrit to understand social customs. Fast forward to the 16th century and Abu Fazl is writing the Ain Akbari. He was an absolute empiricist, meticulously documenting everything from Akbar's revenue system down to the remote tribal structures of the empire.
Then later on, early European merchants and chaplains, folks like Duarte Barbosa and Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, added another layer to this empirical foundation. They weren't just passing through. They were directly observing the Indian caste system and daily customs, talking with locals and writing eyewitness reports that really enriched this growing sociography.
Which brings us to part 3, the British colonial lens, information as power.
You see, the Western view of India was heavily fractured. It's like they were looking through 3 completely different, highly biased lenses. The Orientalists romanticized this timeless, static, spiritual India. The missionaries looked at the exact same society and just saw superstitions requiring mass conversion. But the administrators? They were using cold, utilitarian rationalism. They wanted to understand the society strictly to manage it and, let's be honest, to exploit its resources effectively.
This administrative lens had massive real-world consequences. Administrators like B.H. Baden-Powell created rigid categories of land ownership. He totally challenged the romantic myth of the autonomous village republic and instead classified villages strictly to simplify tax collection. But here's the catch. Acting in terms of these strict colonial categories latently directed attention completely away from the actual complex internal politics and social relations that were happening on the ground.
Ultimately, tools like the census weren't just innocent science projects. They were weapons of policy. Take the 1901 census under Herbert Risley. He noticed the tendency of tribes to absorb into Hinduism and actively deplored it. So the census meticulously recorded and categorized Hindu castes while conveniently ignoring similar distinctions in other religions. It was a deliberate divide-and-rule strategy to promote fissiparousness, or deep, lasting divisions, among the native population.
Eventually, Indian nationalist leaders caught on to what was happening. They realized that these official records, while providing valuable demographic data, were actively seeding long-term political fragmentation. In fact, that's exactly why the census in independent India eventually stopped recording data on a caste basis entirely.
All right, let's hit part 4, the Indian intellectual response, reclaiming the narrative.
Sparked by the ferment of Western education and colonial critique, Indian intellectuals began pushing back. They started forming their own societies, like the Bengal Social Science Association, which aggressively gathered its own empirical data through questionnaires. They wanted to systematically classify facts and understand their own country, but on their own terms, to actually assist in the promotion of measures for the good of the country.
Pioneers like Brajendranath Seal and Binoy Kumar Sarkar looked at these Western models and essentially said, "No way." They completely rejected this Orientalist frame of reference. They challenged the unilinear, evolutionary models of British anthropologists, insisting you just can't judge Indian institutions based on Western value judgments. They argued that social development was multilinear, which really laid the intellectual groundwork for a truly Indian sociology.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, Early Academic Beginnings, Institutionalizing the Science. So when does this actually become a formal university subject? Well, though it was recognized much later than disciplines like economics, sociology officially took root in 1919 at Bombay University. It started under the leadership of Sir Patrick Geddes, a really fascinating guy who passionately emphasized viewing life as an integrated, multidisciplinary whole. He brought a strong ecological awareness to the study of society, focusing heavily on town planning and the relationship between work, place, and folk.
Then you have Geddes' student, the legendary G.S. Gurye, taking the reins at Bombay. Gurye was incredible because he blended strict empirical fieldwork with a profound knowledge of Sanskrit sacred texts to analyze Indian culture. He supervised structural functionalists and Marxists alike and ultimately founded the Indian Sociological Society in 1952, which firmly solidified the discipline's foundation in the country.
All of this sparked a really dynamic synthesis of academic thought in India. You basically had two main camps. On one hand, you have the Bombay School, which was heavily focused on empirical methods and using sacred texts to understand caste and culture. And on the other hand, you have the Lucknow School, featuring giants like Radhakamal Mukherjee and D.P. Mukherjee, who leaned heavily into social ecology, dialectical logic, and analyzing the deep conflicts and culture changes occurring across society.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, you really have to ask yourself this final, crucial question. Given this incredibly complex history of colonial record-keeping and fierce intellectual rebellion, how much of what we accept as modern social reality today is just a leftover category from a bygone era? It's something to think about. Keep questioning the lens through which you view the world. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.